Welcome to Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in the 12th and final episode of Season 4, we'll be talking with Fred Ritchin about photography for a better world. Fred Ritchin is Dean Emeritus at the International Center of Photography and previously was Professor of Photography and Imaging at New York University for more than 20 years. He was picture editor of Horizon and the New York Times Magazine, executive editor of Camera Arts Magazine, created the first multimedia version of the New York Times newspaper, and then conceived and edited the Times' first nonlinear online documentary project titled Bosnia: Uncertain Paths to Peace, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in Public Service. He also conceptualized the Four Corners Project, a software that allows photographers to contextualize their imagery, and is working with major organizations on ways to support the credibility of the photograph as witness in the age of artificial intelligence. He teaches and lectures widely on photography, human rights, artificial intelligence, and alternative media. His books on the future of imaging include In Our Own Image: The Coming Revolution in Photography, published in 1990, After Photography, published in 2008, and Bending the Frame: Photojournalism, Documentary, and the Citizen, published in 2013. His next book, The Synthetic Eye, about the challenges of artificial intelligence, will be published by Thames and Hudson in 2024. I wonder if we could start with you just telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
My name is Fred Ritchin. I've been working in this field for half a century at this point. I started at Time Life Books in 1973 as a researcher. This was within a year that the Weekly Life magazine had stopped publication. The same building, some of the same people. And it was the era of the Vietnam War. It was the era of photography in print, occupying a big space in public consciousness. So the Vietnam War, the year before, the photograph of the girl being napalmed and burning during the Vietnam War, is credited or thought to have done a lot to provoke not only demonstrations and discussion, but also help to possibly even end the war. The civil rights movement, pictures from that era. There was just a sense that the still photograph itself in print, magazines, newspapers throughout the world, could focus the public's attention on matters of importance, provoke discussions, debates, and even change the world for the better. So that's where I started. I became picture editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine in 1978. And I was executive editor of Camera Arts magazine. I was picture editor of Horizon magazine. I started the documentary photography program at the International Center of Photography, a one-year program in 1983, 40 years ago, and co-founded Pixel Press and directed it in 1999, which was an online publication mostly for documentary photography, trying to use the web online to do things differently, nonlinear, interactive, as opposed to the more conventional linear photo essays you would see in print. And I, at that point, also began working a lot in human rights with UNICEF, WHO, UNFPA on projects to end polio worldwide, on projects to the Millennium Development Goals to help young people have, adequate education, healthcare, clean water, and so on. And using photographs in book form, exhibition form, online, in multiple languages to try to advance, good things. And then I was a professor of photography and imaging at New York University for 23 years, where I also taught for 11 of those in the interactive telecommunications program. And with Susan Meiselas, we began the Photography and Human Rights program in 2010, working with the Magnum Foundation and New York University, which became the Photography and Social Justice program. I've also working on my fourth book on the future of imaging. So in 1990, I published In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution in Photography, which was the first book on the digital revolution and its potential impact on photography and imaging. And in 1984, I'd already begun writing for the New York Times Magazine on the coming revolution in digital imaging about 6 years before Photoshop, using very expensive Cytex machine just to show, and actually to warn people that if we kept doing what you could do digitally, which is to very quickly and undetectably manipulate photographs, that we're going to have a real problem with credibility of the photograph as a witness in the future. And then I wrote the book After Photography, and then Bending the Frame, which is, the subtitle was Photojournalism Documentary and the Citizen. That was really about alternative strategies for, advancing social justice, using imaging. One of the ideas was peace photography versus war photography, that, peace photography is proactive. You try to diminish or even stop bad things from happening as opposed to wait for them to happen and then make graphic imaging of it. So, these are the things that don't usually win the prizes, but they're the ones, for example, when I worked on the End of Polio campaign, whatever number of children did not get polio because of it, you don't see photographs of the ones who are healthy and just say, wow, that was pretty good. Often photography is biased to showing death, destruction, apocalypse, and that's what wins awards, versus the imaging that people make that make bad things not happen or diminish them when they do. So the one I did on Bosnia, Uncertain Paths to Peace, for the New York Times online with Gilles Perez, the photographer, was 1996. And I went to the Times and I said, they just signed a peace treaty with Bosnia. And wouldn't it be a good idea to use photography to be about peace, not about war, especially since the web was new? And when you have a new medium, it's nice to do different things with it. So we did it. It was a big, big project, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in Public Service by the New York Times. Immediately rejected because it was not on paper and therefore not serious. I think it took 12 years for the Pulitzer Committee to accept online-only projects as being serious and meriting a Pulitzer Prize. But the idea was, how do people make peace when they've been at, Serbs, Croats, Muslims in Bosnia? How do they make peace? Which seemed to me a lot more important than simply showing over and over again how people make war. So if you go to a photo library and you ask, can I see all the peace photography books? They probably don't know what you're talking about, but they probably have, dozens or hundreds of war photography books. So I'm very much against photography being used as a reactive medium, waiting for bad things and showing them, as opposed to, looking at the underlying systems, like Philip Jones Griffith's Vietnam Inc., which was very much war as a corporate takeover, as opposed to, just, graphic images of violence. What happened to women in Vietnam because of the war, how they were sexualized and they became sex workers when that, certainly at that degree had not happened before. How it affected the industry, how it affected the village leadership, as opposed to, just the spectacle of war. So most of my career has been about, alternative methodologies to try to make the world a better place in local ways, national, international ways, all over the world. My students over the years, particularly the last number of years, have tended to come from many, many different countries. And, they do often, really important work in trying to push things forward in a good way. And, you can't expect to make an iconic photograph at this point. The last one that I think of is 2015, Aylin Kurdi, the young Syrian boy who drowned trying to escape Syria with his family. Those iconic photographs don't happen anymore. We don't have front pages of newspapers to put them on or magazines. And you can't just, as Marshall McLuhan said, you can't just be looking in the rearview mirror, while at the same time talking about how fast we're moving into the future. So, it's really recognizing that it's a different time. How do you reach people on Instagram? How do you reach people, on posters? How do you reach people in websites, print, zines, books, exhibitions, all the different ways you can do it, because basically at the end of time, at the end of all this, it's not really about photography, it's about the world and whether the images are useful in the world, not just celebrating that's a great photographer, that's a great image, but what do they do in the world? And, that's been the focus of what I do. So that's a long answer to your short question.
No, it's a really good answer to kick us off for sure, because I think there is obviously already so much in that I have questions about and that we can really dig into. But I guess the first question I have is a really broad question, which is just that in that sort of 50-year career that you've had in the industry, I guess you've seen a lot of changes, not only in technologies, but also in ethics and how ethics has evolved in that time and changed. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. I know that's a very broad question. I apologize.
Look, I think, one of the things we've done incredibly badly is that we don't know what ethics are in the field. There's no universal standards for it. Certainly, as a reader, you should be able to know what are the ethics of the photographer, what is okay to do and not okay, what is okay to do in Belfast versus New York, versus Beijing or wherever. Is it the same ethics or not? And, and I think ethics, as a focus is also a lot more variegated than we think of it. It's, what are the ethics of a foreign photographer going to a place where they just arrived and photographing? Is that ethical to do? What do you tell the reader or not tell the reader about what you're doing? Certainly, I was thinking the other day that Eddie Adams made the famous 1968 photograph of the execution of a Viet Cong in the street, which did a lot, in my opinion and other people's opinion, to certainly at least provoke a discussion about the war, the ethics of the war, but possibly even to end the war. And he was an American in Vietnam. Nick Ut, 1972, as a Vietnamese man, photographer, made an equally important photograph of a little girl burning from napalm, which also did a lot to end the war. I would suggest that both images are important, whether you're from Vietnam or not from Vietnam. So it's not automatic that you have to be from the culture to be able to photograph it. But it is, in my opinion, a sense just like a writer. You need to know the culture well enough to know that what you're photographing is important, is essential, is representative. It can't be, I remember they did a day in the life project in Japan, and so many of the photographs seemed to be of Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's because they were in English. And the foreign photographer didn't necessarily speak Japanese. So of course they gravitate to what they could read. But does it mean that Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's were important in Japan or not, or just that it was easy for them to decipher? So those are ethical issues, and a lot of it has to do really with transparency and being authors of the image. The photographer could write underneath, I had just arrived in Japan 2 days before. I was tired and so on, but I was attracted to, these stores that reminded me of where I live, wherever I come from. You could be transparent, but, that way you're saying this is not necessarily representative of Japan, but it's of interest to me. And, there's ethics of, can I give food to people? Can I give water to people? Is this is this okay? And, I think, again, it has to be explicit. If you're working in a place of starvation, I think it would be criminal not to give food and water to people. But at the same time, you don't use it to get people to pose for you. You have to do it, in such a way that you share as a human being, but you don't use it to manipulate people. And these things, again, have to be explicit in terms of, what you're doing and so on. I had a conversation. I had two students. One was Palestinian, one was from another country, and both were covering Gaza during the violence, the Israeli bombing and so on. And the Palestinian was saying, yeah, if I see a little kid, who's got separated from his or her parents, I pick him up and I try to help. And the foreign photographer says, no, I photograph. That's not my job. Well, is one wrong or right ethically? What does that mean? How do you figure it out? The famous image of the vulture in Africa, where the photographer ended up committing suicide because he was so criticized for not picking up the little girl. Well, you could argue that the photograph actually helped many children much more than picking up one little girl would have helped. But he was so harassed by critics of it who have no idea of the situation. So I think we have to do a much, much better job about being transparent, and it's not a kind of magic that happens. How do we do our work? What do we do with our work? What's okay to do and not do? What about a photo opportunity that's staged? So many of them are just a manipulation of the public by whoever's staging it, whether it's the photographer or the subject. And again, I think we have to say this was staged, and ideally do a second image of the staging so you could roll over online and see the second image, and see that, they stuck in air conditioning, they put in lights, whatever they did to stage it, so make it look a certain way or not another way. It's not spontaneous. A long time ago in 1992, with a number of editors and photographers, we came up with these labels, of what things are. This is a photo opportunity by X person, or this is a retouched image by so-and-so person, to make it clear to the reader that everything is not a photograph. It's not spontaneous. This is a portrait photograph by so-and-so, in which there is some staging, just to tell the people, just like a writer, you say, this is an op-ed, this is an essay, this is a poem, this is a novel, this is a news article, just to be clear what your strategy is there. So there, if you have to view the photographer as the author, just like a writer, and they're responsible for the contextualization of the image. So I developed this Four Corners software which I spoke about at World Press. I did the keynote speech in 2004, where every corner of the photograph, if you use it, like the bottom right corner, the reader, if they, access that corner, they would see the caption, the credit, and your code of ethics. My code of ethics is I'm a fashion photographer. I don't work with underweight models. I'm a wildlife photographer. I don't work in zoos and pretend it's the wildlife. I'm a photojournalist. I don't, retouch my images afterwards or stage them, or whatever your ethics is. You could say it in one or two sentences. You don't need 14 pages to describe your ethics. And if you want to link to a bigger code, you could do that. The bottom left corner is the backstory. So, maybe it's an interview with a bystander who says, yeah, that's the way it was or wasn't. Or the person photographed saying, yeah, I'm homeless, but the reason I look the way I look is because there's no showers available. That you have another point of view. The upper left corner was related imagery. So when Aylan Kurdi died on the beach in Turkey, the Syrian boy, the refugee, I showed that you could put a family photograph of him and his brother playing with a big stuffed animal when he was alive, so that you're just not seeing a kind of, picture of a corpse, but you see who the boy was when he was alive. And then the upper right corner was links to other websites and things that would give you more information. So in a multimedia world, interactive, you can do a lot more than you could do on paper. On paper, you do a caption. It's hard to do all these other things. But we need to take advantage of these technologies to do more and let the reader in, make it much more a collaboration with the person being depicted or people being depicted. Because, one of the things I do with my class is I ask them to do interactive portraits. So you make a portrait of somebody, you show them the photograph, and you say, is this you? And then you record their voice saying, what they think of the portrait. And then the reader has the choice of clicking and hearing their voice. And they may say the portrait is exactly who I am, it's not who I am, whatever they want to say. We can do these things now, but we don't do them. And a lot of it is because we want to keep the authority to ourselves as photographers. And a lot of it has to do with we have the camera and you don't. But now they do have the camera. Almost everybody seems to have cameras, or many people do. So you could also say, what pictures do you have of yourself or your family? I could include, and people could click and then see more images. You could collaborate as opposed to impose a vision. And sometimes I've shown that to professionals whose response is, you're trying to take away my power. And I said, no, I'm trying to give you more power, because that way you're actually getting the point of view of the people that you're photographing. You may arrive in Japan, you don't speak the language, but then you show it with an interpreter to the person and then say, is this you? And they say, well, to tell you the truth, I'm actually a happy person, and the way you photograph me, I look kind of sad. So it's not really me. And then that's nice. It doesn't hurt you as a photographer. It just adds stuff. But we don't do these things, even though these things have been possible to do for decades at this point. We just don't do it. It's not a question of money. It doesn't cost any more to ask somebody their opinion. It's really just a question of wanting to go outside the 20th century into the 21st.
I think it's really interesting. You said, we want to keep the authority to ourselves. And I feel like there's also an element of the sort of veneer of objectivity of photography that I think in some ways, do you think we're maybe trying to protect that in some way as well?
Well, I think everybody knows photographs are not objective, they're interpretive. I think that what you're doing is that if, I have a camera, therefore I decide what life is like in front of the lens. And I think what we all know is that's one perspective. The second photographer might see it differently. The insider versus the outsider might see it differently. They both might have interesting perspectives. But I think it's trying to keep a little, it's like when I worked at the New York Times, the slogan was all the news that's fit to print. Well, who decides? They do. But of course we know that that's not true, that there's lots of news that's fit to print, but we decide it's not. So, I think that we're just sort of succumb to this ideology of instant knowledge that you get by holding the camera, instead of the idea of saying, I'm an interpreter of events. Me as a writer, I don't ever assume I know everything. I just think I have some points of view. I report, I do my best. I know that there's stuff I may not know about, I may leave out, I may not have noticed. If I'm in a foreign country, I certainly am aware. I may not speak the language, but a photographer, needs also to be aware they don't speak the language and so on and so forth, and they're viewing out of the prism of what they know. I remember I was at a conference and some guy was describing how he photographed an African-American woman standing up to the police at a demonstration in the United States. And, somebody asked him a question. He said, well, I'm a sports photographer and I photographed it as a sports photographer, as an event. Well, does that mean that you understand the sort of the, what's going on politically, the racial issues and so on? It's not a sporting event. It's something very different. And so one size doesn't fit all. There's certain understandings that may be, a detail in a photograph, that is the most compelling and important, but you may not know the detail if you're not knowledgeable about the situation, that you're in, or vice versa. You may use certain details to stereotype people. So-and-so went to a fancy thing and was wearing sneakers or basketball shoes or something. Well, maybe they broke their foot. Maybe, there's all kinds of different things going on And it's really easy to stereotype, that person, is when I worked with Salgado, for example, the work on Sahel with people, in a famine and ill, he was accused by Susan Sontag and others for making the people look beautiful. Well, the people were beautiful, just like rich people are beautiful. Poor people can be beautiful. Rich people can be beautiful. Just because you don't have anything to eat doesn't mean you're not beautiful. You can't put people in the box that, this is an immigrant family, so, they have to look depressed. Well, maybe they're not depressed. Maybe they're actually happier than the rich people. You can't just work off of stereotypes, and often they're unconscious. We just do it. This is, I remember as a photo editor, I could have a pile of photographs of Palestinians, a pile of photographs of Israelis. I could choose, the kind of, make it look one way or another. I could choose the, smiling, open, warm Palestinian and the kind of, dictatorial Israeli, or I could choose the very, angry Palestinian and the smiling Israeli. I could change it either way. I had a lot of power, and you have to think a lot about what you're doing in doing that, because you change people, not necessarily that they realize it consciously, but you change the way they think about it. I have a picture of Putin. Okay, I'm going to make him look, X way, but maybe he isn't that way. Maybe I'm just doing it to fit the stereotype, or of Biden, or of, any other world leader. You could just, keep showing them, one way or another, because that's the stereotype, that's the projection.
Absolutely. I think that you touched on something there that I wonder if you could expand on, because it's something that I have been struggling to articulate, and I wonder if you could help me. Because, you said that, we all know that photographs aren't objective. But at the same time, subconsciously, when we see photographs, it does influence how we see the world. So what is it about the photographic image that impacts us psychologically in that way, as opposed to, obviously a drawing or a painting? Obviously, there's the difference in indexicality. But I'm wondering that we know that there's, subjectivity in photography. We know that there's manipulation. We know that there's now AI, but the photorealistic image carries a power and a weight that sets it apart.
Because we conflate it with seeing. It's much more close to the way we see the world than painting normally is, or conventionally is, or drawing, or so on. It's a recording of the visible, in a way that we, have thought for a long time is more important than our own memories in many cases. It's a recording of the detail in a form. It's a construct, but the form is very similar to the way we see the world. We don't see it that way. None of us, have, a depth of field like the lens and can see all the areas simultaneously in the field of vision, but we conflate it with the way we see. And I think, though, touching on AI, a lot of the work I'm doing is with these synthetic images. I'm beginning to reject photographs that are actual photographs as a recording of the visible, because I become, whether I want to or not, suspicious, because I've seen enough synthetic images at this point that I'm beginning to reject photography and be very, skeptical of it. You could argue in some ways that's good, but it's also very, very bad. If a girl is burning from napalm in Vietnam and I'm rejecting it because I'm skeptical and I don't go to the demonstration about the war, that's not a good result for the girl and for people like her in wherever it would be in the world, or ourselves, with climate change or racial justice or economic justice or whatever it would be. When Google a few days ago, the number one search image that came up on search for Tank Man was a synthetic image, pretty much a selfie of the Tank Man in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And I can't get that image out of my mind, even though the person who was the tank man was never identified and was always anonymous. And what was really amazing about it was how he risked his life against a column of tanks without knowing who he is. He never got credit. He never became a hero, or, as far as we know, maybe he was or wasn't, captured or not, but nobody's ever proved it. And now in my mind, he just looks like a lot of other people. And those synthetic images, which in my experimentation, I could go back in history. I did a 1815 photograph, I think, of Berlin, which is not a photograph, obviously, because photography wasn't even invented then, in which you see cars in the street, and cars were not invented then. So I'm starting to look at stuff like that. And if you show me now a photograph of actual Berlin or anywhere in, another time, I'm more and more skeptical at this point, of what it is or isn't. And, when Trump was arrested first on synthetic imagery before photography, you start to doubt photography. And I think what we've done an extraordinarily good job is destroying photography as a credible witness, so that what you're talking about is not going to be happening. And even historical images, I've been making images, for World War II from southern plantations in the U.S., which say exactly the opposite of what we know to have happened. And the images are credible. And they're very, very disturbing. And I'm not releasing them, online, because then future generations of AI gets trained on them, and, racist people could use them to show that they were right, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's what we're on the verge of, that kind of extraordinary ambition in society to destroy the credible witness. That's what I started writing about 1984, which is almost 40 years ago, trying to warn us that that's what we're going to end up doing. And that's what we did at this point. I could go back, to the Troubles in Northern Ireland and depict scenes that never happened, but that look credible, that look real. And then the actual scenes that happened, people could start to doubt that they really happened. And it kind of destabilizes histories, family histories. If somebody's divorced, they could go back to the family album and knock out the divorced spouse. If somebody never took a vacation, you can see them all over the world on vacations. The new Adobe generative fill, which allows you to put in any background you want in seconds, to a photograph. Well, there's my grandmother, and she was actually standing, in Manhattan or something, and yet, here she is, at the Great Wall of China. Wow, I didn't know my grandmother went to the Great Wall of China. And then the grandchildren don't know what their family did or didn't do. So, to me, that's the massive issue that we're not dealing with for 40 years of, trying to preserve this credibility. We really have wanted to destroy it, and the photo industry has done very, very little to preserve it in that period of time.
What do you think could have been done or should have been done before now that could have changed the course of that? Or alternatively, what should we be thinking about and doing now?
Well, in 1994, I led a campaign which was called the Not a Lens icon. So if a photograph was highly manipulated, you put the icon on it, which was a circle inside a square with a diagonal going through it. The lens, this is not a lens, so that people would know they could click on it and find out how it was manipulated. If a photograph was staged, you would say so in the caption. You wouldn't just run it, as if it was spontaneous. So it's not just the digital manipulation, it's also the staging, the manipulation of how you make an image, and so on. I'm now, part of a campaign with World Press Photo and Magnum Photos and National Press Photographers and others, to a statement of principles that, photographers sign on, to be fair. And if they're using AI or doing anything manipulative, they tell the reader they're transparent in what they're doing it. But you cannot, have this kind of culture of impunity where, it's fine to change all these magazine covers because it sells more magazines without telling people what you're doing. You can't put filters, into cameras or filtering afterwards, and photographers use it and pretend that's the way it was. just because it looks better. That's not what photography of the documentary sort or journalistic sort is. It's trying to record what's actually happening, not what should happen, but what is happening to the best of your ability. And, in a consumer society where you get what you want, you make everything into what it should be, not what it is. And, I think that every young photographer in every journalism school or every documentary school, should be signing on to a statement of principles. And then if you click on their name, you go to their website and here's my statement of principles. I don't do this. I don't do that. I do this. I do this. In 5 sentences, 3 sentences, so the reader knows. Just like for me as an author, I could make up stuff as a writer, but I don't, to the best of my ability. And that's what people count on me to do. And I'm not hiding behind my pen or my computer or my camera. And I think we're unbelievably slow, even now, to recognize the danger of it. Because, we call it the liar's dividend. Once you start seeing 3, 4, 5, 6 faked images, you begin to disbelieve all images. And, again, why don't we have iconic photographs at this point? In this century, I can only think of a few. And I think one of the reasons is because we generally don't believe anymore, the photograph the way we did in the 20th century as having that kind of authenticity. It's we look back and say, oh, in Vietnam it did all this or whatever. But it certainly, did not work in the war in Afghanistan, where there's not one iconic photograph in a 20-year war. It doesn't work, but we don't realize that. We don't, accept that and try to do something about it in a big way. So again, if you use 4 corners or you do double images or, you become the author and you're more transparent, you give more context, all this helps.
Absolutely.
You can't just come around with a photograph and say, this is the way things are, because I can make a synthetic image and say, this is not the way you say it, this is the way I'm saying it. And I could also do it from the point of view of the really bad people who do really bad things in the world, and they could make synthetic images, which unfortunately, there's a high probability they will, and saying, look, all the good stuff we did, when in fact you did some really horrible stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that idea of transparency as well, like that's something that we've really been pushing for at the Photography Ethics Center as well, through our Statement of Ethics campaign, to try to get people, to record their ethics and make it public and increase that transparency. So I think that all really resonates. Is there anything that I should have asked but didn't ask?
The question you asked me, I would reverse. What should we be doing? Well, I think that every person in this who makes photographs, edits photographs, curates photographs, deals with photographs, knows the answer. Everybody knows the answer. We have to be more transparent with what we're doing. And they cannot depend on institutions to do it for them. They have to do it because they have a responsibility to those they photograph to do it in such a way that the reader finds it credible. You cannot go to a famine, an earthquake, a war, almost anywhere. You have a contract with the people you're photographing, which is implicit, to do your best to represent what's going on with them in the world. And if that's not received as credible, then you failed. And to do that, you cannot say it's somebody else's problem. You have to do everything you can on your website, because when I started, there was no websites. We were dependent on editors and curators. Now we're not. But I could do models of the right way to do it on my website, anybody's website, and then maybe publications, other photographers will pick up on it. I remember Stephen Ferry's website for many years has said, I'm a nonfiction photographer. Okay, that's interesting that he said that, but it's an individual who could affect others. So I think we're all in it together to come to the solution, because otherwise what we're doing really begins to fall apart. It's not just the problem of the big publications. It's not just the problem of the big agencies. It has to come from the ground up as well. and maybe coming from the ground up will then affect, to some extent, Google, Getty, Apple, whoever needs to be affected, and say, it's even if I look for Tank Man now, which I did this week, he's still, that image, the synthetic one, is still in the top 10 there. And when you look at it, you don't know it's synthetic. You have to click and go to it and figure it out. And a lot of people won't do that. So don't you have the obligation to put an icon on it saying synthetic AI or something of that nature? Because you're playing with our history. And, when you see, the discussions online about all this, it's always somebody else's fault, pretty much. They're not doing it right. Well, we have to do it right. So it's, when I teach, that's what I say. I say you can't wait if you wait for the big tech companies to do it right or the big publications to do it right, it could be a long wait. You have to start it now, provoke it now. There has to be, photographer collectives have to come up with their statements and get together and form movements and do stuff. When I was young and, we demonstrated against the Vietnam War, it wasn't like waiting for the government to do the right thing. You had to kind of push it and then hope that you would have some impact in what you were doing, or civil rights movement or whatever it would be. So we can't absolve ourselves of that kind of responsibility. So that's it.
Absolutely. I think that's a really useful point. And the last question that I like to ask everyone, and this is things that we've touched on, but I wonder if you could maybe give a summary of it from your own perspective, is what does photography ethics mean to you?
The purpose of photography is not to make more images. It's not to be celebrated as the greatest photographer. It's not to be picked as, the picture of the year. The ethics of it is that you're a citizen of the world and you're using photography to make the world a better place, whether as a witness, as an advocate, as a family photographer, who's keeping a record of your family, the weddings, the celebrations, the graduations, the sports events, whatever it is. You're using it in such a way to be useful, to be helpful in the world. And this sort of disconnect, like the photo festivals, where there's great photos, other photographers see them, and then we say photography is flourishing. Well, but my question is, what's its impact on the world outside the bubble of other photographers? And to me, that's what photo ethics is, I used to start many of my lectures, I don't care about photography, I care about the world. And if we could use the photography to make it a better world, that's the ethics of it. Again, whether you're a witness, or you're trying to be more proactive, or, whatever way you're using it, preserve what you're doing in such a way that it's credible, and do not do stuff that makes the work of your colleagues less credible as well. If you're, for example, saying, okay, from now on, I'm going to cover things, with artificial intelligence and not go there. That could be a great art project, but be very careful that people don't start assuming that's another form of photojournalism and therefore degrading what other people are doing, actually go to those places. There's certainly a place for AI, a big place for AI. It's very good at, making images of the potential futures like climate change, so the worst doesn't happen. We know what it might look like in 30 years or whatever. Photography, you can't photograph 30 years from now, but AI is very good with data, to synthesize imagery of what it might look like if we don't do anything about climate change. That's very useful, and that's very ethical and very helpful. It's not that AI is bad and photography is good or vice versa, but to use it in a way that you're aware, just like, anybody. If you're a social worker, if you're a surgeon, if you're a police person, anything, you do your job to try to make things better. And it's not just to say, I made the best photo of the year or something. What does that mean? If a surgeon says, I did the best operation of the year, the next sentence can't be, but the patient died. It has to be, that I was helpful. Or I'm a social worker, I work with 47 children, And, some of them actually, are doing much better. Wow, that's great. It's not just that I'm a good talker or I dress better than the other person or whatever it would be. We're all in this together, whether photographers, social workers, surgeons, police, anybody. We're in it to try to push things forward in a good way. And that's really what ethics is about for anybody.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This is the final episode in Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. You can stay connected with us by enrolling in our online courses on photojournalism ethics at www.photoethics.thinkific.com or by following us on social media. We're on X, formerly known as Twitter, at PhotoEthics, and on Instagram at Photo Ethics Center. Thanks very much for joining me throughout Season 4.